As higher education leaders continue to adapt to the evolving demands of the COVID-19 pandemic, they must also find ways to advance their support for hybrid learning models, both for students and for faculty. That will require devoting greater attention to advancing their cybersecurity strategies in ways that won't compromise user privacy or accessibility to resources. And that will ultimately mean embracing a zero trust security model. Here to talk about the benefits of zero trust security model and how university technology leaders should approach the evolving demands of hybrid learning at their institutions are Donna Kidwell, Chief Information Security and Digital Trust Officer at the Arizona State University, and Helen Patton, Advisory CISO at Cisco and a former Chief Information Security Officer at Ohio State University. Donna and Helen, thanks so much for joining us.
Nice to be here, Wyatt.
Well, let me start with you, Donna. How are new demands for hybrid learning models impacting security risks at higher education institutions?
Oh, my goodness. Well, we've seen a pretty unprecedented time where more and more students, in fact, this year, we've got the largest enrollments that we've ever seen at ASU, whether that's online or on the campus. As folks are really considering what the future holds as we counter this COVID environment, it really is creating wondrous opportunities, but then all the challenges that go with those opportunities around how we meet them with the technology that they need. And now we know that the learners are going to be in all sorts of places, not necessarily the traditional ones.
And Helen, what would you say is most promising about moving to a zero trust security model? And why is it, in fact, more important than ever?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That so zero trust sort of philosophically says, through the security lens, says we can no longer rely and assume that if people are on campus or on our networks that they're trustworthy and everybody else is not. Well, one, we're in this hybrid environment. So there is still a lot of people who are on our networks and are physically located on campus. But there are plenty who aren't, and there are plenty who won't be. Like that, certainly online education is taking off, but also remote work and hybrid work. In research universities, that's always been the case. We've had researchers who've been off in far-flung places trying to do their work. So zero trust is something that higher ed really fits well with, actually. So, in the old private sector model of you're on our network, you're behind our firewall, we're going to trust you and everything's easy, that never really worked for higher ed in the first place. So I think this philosophy is allowing the rest of the world to catch up with higher ed in the way we've been working for a really long time, but to be able to provide solutions that we can consume that aren't super expensive or super weird or needing us to have really big staffs to be able to manage, because security vendors are now offering these products that can be consumed by higher ed. So I think the timing's actually really great for zero trust in the higher ed space, for sure.
Well, Don, I'm sure you have a lot of priorities on your plate. What makes the zero trust philosophy an approach that is important to you and offers greater assurance for things like privacy and inclusivity?
I really love the way Helen framed this question, and I think that's a really powerful way to think about it, because we're really focused on who we include and how they succeed, who has access to a tier 1 research environment. And if you think of zero trust and all the various pillars of it, each of those pillars gets different teams that are on campuses like ours, highly distributed. Some of them live firmly in the research space, some of them live firmly in our facility spaces, some of them are in your core IT group. We now have pillars that allow each of those teams to really align, whether it's least privilege and thinking about the future of access management, or network segmentation and understanding the needs of a tier 1 research institution who is bringing everybody in their own device and all sorts of fantastic devices brought by our students, while at the same time doing defense research or having strong HIPAA requirements. So Helen's exactly right. We've always been positioned for the complexity, and now we're starting to see that alignment and prioritization, and as Helen pointed out, a maturity of tools. so that we can really look at our technology stacks. We can look at where we've got different vendors assisting us and what kinds of things, which parts of the solutions are they providing. It doesn't have to be a one shoe fits all. It can actually be tailored towards these needs as they vary across the different units on the campus.
Well, Helen, I think zero trust is usually associated with security first and foremost, but talk to us a little bit about why it also provides greater assurance for privacy and inclusivity.
Oh, yeah, it's an interesting thing, because I think when you talk to higher ed people who are not security people and you use the term zero trust, two things happen. They get offended that we don't trust them, number one. And number two, they're like, well, if you're going to be as flexible as you say you're going to be with these technologies, now you're monitoring us 24/7. And what is the privacy implication of that? So I think there's a lot of misconceptions amongst higher ed people in terms of what kind of monitoring we're already doing. When I was the CISO at Ohio State, there were plenty of people that just assumed I was reading their email because I was the security officer. I don't care about their email. I don't have time to read their email. Their email is not a security threat to me. But this sort of question of at a macro level, at a metadata level, there are elements that we can use to make people more protected. It is a really important feature of zero trust. And I think it actually is hand in glove with privacy, because it allows us to let people do what they want to do, be who they want to be, but still have a level of assurance that they're doing that in a secure way without having to see absolutely everything they're doing, without having to see every website that they're browsing or every document that they're looking at. Now, if we need to, because of compliance requirements, we could extend a zero trust architecture to that kind of depth, but we don't have to. And so, again, I think, our old model of security was, let's see all the data go over through our firewall. Let's make sure it's not encrypted so we can inspect it. And then let's apply security controls around it based on what we see. That's not how zero trust works, actually. So I think this is a step forward to a privacy model that we didn't have capability for before.
Well, it certainly sounds like there's an education issue with leadership as well. Donna, I'm just curious, the conversations that you have with your leadership, what is it that they should consider as you present and they evaluate the case for a zero trust security approach?
I think an important part of the strategy that we have at ASU has included digital trust, directly in my title, and a director of digital trust initiatives, which allows us to both have the conversation around the traditional cybersecurity, although I wouldn't say it's terribly traditional as we move towards a true zero trust model, but it allows us to have those traditional conversations while we're also saying the nature of privacy is vastly shifting at the same time, not only as the technology shifting, but the sophistication of our learners and expectations of people who in all sorts of ways are working with the campus. So by having both a zero trust and a digital trust, we get to say, okay, here's how we're handling the machine side of this. Here's how we're handling devices. Here's how we're thinking about the physical aspects and the cloud aspects of our environment. And then on the digital trust side, here's how we're really thinking about the relationships that we are building with our learners and our faculty and our researchers and everyone else, athletics, everybody else that's involved in a complicated campus community. We really get to think about how does the digital experience that they have then create a relationship of trust. Some of that's as simple as when they come in, let's say they're visiting faculty on EdRoam and they then get into our networks. It feels like a seamless experience that we understand what they should have access to and what kinds of work they should be able to do. Similarly with the student or the parent of a student, when they come on campus, there's not friction in terms of what they get, how they get it, and they have a pervasive sense that we've actually thought through what their experiences, digital experiences need to be on the campus. So that design effort goes through the entire relationship. So it's been very helpful to separate out what's happening in the zero trust space. To Helen's point, it can sound somewhat offensive, and to say digital trust is something that hits different teams. It might involve your financial advisors and folks who are actually heads-on with the experience centers, or individuals that are looking in privacy at very different ways, but wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as classic technologists.
Some great points. Helen, as a former university CISO and now working on the industry side, what would be some of the things you'd recommend higher ed leaders really should consider as they evaluate embracing zero trust?
Yeah. So first of all, when I talk to higher ed CISOs, I was just having an online conversation with cohort this week. A lot of them are saying, yeah, I'm not really doing zero trust, or I haven't begun it. And I would actually challenge leaders to question that assumption. We are, all of us, doing some level of multi-factor authentication. We are all already doing network segmentation. We are already looking at how do we, to Donna's point, make it as seamless as possible, the onboarding and authentication processes of our entire communities, not just our employees. There is already work being done around that lends itself to a zero trust model. So I think, first of all, I would encourage leaders to have specifically a governance group around this and a program around it, but not to think that they've got to start from scratch, but instead build on what they already have and recognize that zero trust really, although it's a series of architectures that enable zero trust philosophies, it's not something you're ever going to completely finish. There's no end to this, because every time we change a technology stack, every time we go from an on-premise system to a cloud system, you are going to have to rethink, what does that mean for security? What does it mean for a zero trust philosophy? What does it mean for the digital trust experience of the people accessing whatever that thing is? And so it does need to be an ongoing part of the operational DNA of an organization. So start with, again, that governance side, a program to get yourself started, but then recognize that it is going to be something that will be ongoing and embrace it that way. And I think schools that do that will ultimately implement a zero trust philosophy in a smart and frictionless, not friction free, but frictionless way. That's how I would recommend people think about it.
Some great recommendations to consider. Well, Donna Kidwell and Helen Patton, thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of your insights on zero trust and higher education.